and creativity in the center of the Rocky Mountains. I'm sorry, I just ran. So I'm like out of breath. Okay. Tonight's program is going to consist of 2 faculty lectures followed by a question and answer period. First, I would like to introduce Chelly Jin. Chelly Jin is a new media artist employing technology as a conduit of self-expression and self-exploration. Her practice weaves the interdisciplinary, creative code, artificial intelligence, installation, print, movement, and performance. She is currently an MFA candidate at the University of California, Los Angeles in Media Arts, where she earned her BA in Design, Media Arts, and Digital Humanities. Please help me welcome Chelly Jin to the stage.
Thank you, everyone. Water, brain, love, program, control, mother, self, system, swallow, whole, home, home. Hi, everyone. My name is Chelly Jin, and I'm a new media artist. I thought I'd start this presentation sharing a little bit of my practice. I decided to start it with a short, adapted excerpt from one of my performances. And yeah, I'll just get right into it. My practice is rather interdisciplinary. I'm exploring themes of belonging, conceptions of home, performing expectations through technology, so specifically through methods, sorry, I'm nervous, of mediating, unpacking, and co-opting technology. But let's start it back at the beginning. As a child, I studied drawing and painting. I grew up in a lot of different places: Arizona, South Korea, Louisiana, Ohio, and Texas. And in 2014, I left to pursue my BA in Design Media Art at UCLA, during which I did a variety of different works, mostly focused on virtual reality experiences, and also doing a lot of research specifically a research project for P5JS, which is a programming language for artists and beginners and education spaces. I also did a lot of biosensor-driven art projects, such as this one titled Hypnagogia, where I connected an EEG brainwave headset called a Muse to an 8 cubic foot light installation using an Arduino. And it was also a performance piece where individuals would come to me in this space. It was this one-on-one interaction where I had this book of my dreams that I'd written down for the 6 years prior, and we would just read them and talk about our dreams together. But yeah, it's this interest in data and this idea of data having revelation, that data could reveal something maybe more about my sense of self or who I am, that lured me in. So I found myself interning at NASA JPL, where I co-authored a paper at the age of 20 designing for rover systems and operations contexts. And this kind of work catapulted me into my career, where I worked at Microsoft as a UX designer for a tool called Viva Insights specifically. And then made a bunch of stuff that kind of ended up on the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg. And it's not customary to share this kind of background in an artist lecture, but I felt that it offered a glimpse into my practice and who I am as an artist, this ingrained fascination with data, technology, and the internet, especially as a child of the internet who grew up with it, drawn to its vibrancy and information, as well as unsure of its ubiquity and reduction and surveillance. But with all of this in mind, I'm going to share some works from 2020 to the present, starting with this work called Dewy Touch. In 2022, I created Dewy Touch, which is a performance and an installation with the Choreographic Coding Lab. It's kind of like a hackathon if you want to think about it that way, but it was dancers, choreographers, artists, and creative people just coming together to make work together. It was hosted by Motion Bank and the A&E Lab in the United Kingdom, and we all came together to create work, and I created this piece exploring this principle, or the many principles of consent in the practice of contact improvisational dance. The performers would wear pulse sensors, either on their fingers or on their ears, that would trigger the stage lighting and visual projection in real time. And then with a series of prompts, a choreographic score, and also this visual live stream of their biodata, the dancers kind of developed this improvised choreography. So a little bit of the score, some moments. But for me, the complexity here is on how we negotiate space and how we give consent with our space in a post-COVID era. Consent in relation to the Me Too movement, bodily consent and autonomy, and technology's facilitation of intimacy. But also during this time, I began a drawing series of these psychedelic still lifes of objects in my home that eventually evolved into some kind of a zine called Coping Mechanisms. Asking an 8-ball for answers, staring at my canker sore, tangled extension cable cobwebs, a home and office, a home office. The zine got readapted into this digital musical website, and as you see, the objects are being moved around in these scenes, and the rooms will actually generate these sound compositions for you and together kind of build this collaborative orchestra. And I call it like a sound feng shui. But what you're seeing now is a performance of this piece done through Zoom, through the School for Poetic Computation. But yeah, you won't hear the sound right now, but know that it's happening. But for me, I want to give a quick side note that sound and computation is just something so lovely to me. And Ada Lovelace, considered the world's first programmer in 1840, created these notes of her understandings of the logic system, notes that she transcribed from Charles Babbage, who created the understandings of our modern day computer, but actually saw the computational system as beyond number crunching and actually something that could be used for music. So it's this example of art actually broadening our understandings of technology and bringing us to like this concept of the logic system. But within both of these works, I feel like I'm trying to find home, really. I reference all the places that I lived prior and this need to belong in my body, this need to belong in the space that I live in. And so in trying to understand myself better and reconcile with my mental health, I created this system of self-therapizing where I'd play between these two characters. One part of me that's pedantic, focused, driven. She is the one who is definitely answering your emails and kind of machinic. And this other part of me that holds my whimsy, the imaginary, the joy, but also can get stuck in cycles of depression and anxiety. And so in trying to reconcile with these two pieces together, I kind of developed this idea of the cyborg. I pulled a lot of literature on cyborgs and the Frankenstein, Liebel, who is a Korean artist, on the cyborgs and monsters, and Ian Chang's Chalice, which is a character in his film Life After Bob, or an animation, if you will. And in playing with this idea of these two sides of me kind of colliding together, I created this show called Under Overwhelmed. Under Overwhelmed is a one-woman show. It delves into this idea of what is programmed socially, genetically, culturally, familially, and uses this through line of Korean pop music and K-beauty as a method to examine and kind of critique this performance of expectation. So actually what you're seeing in this moment is there's a point in the performance where people can log into an app using the QR code and in real time would draw on top of some images, and then that would project onto the projection behind me, and then in real time, I would draw what they were mapping onto my face with like marker or variety of makeup tools. But to me, the show centers around the plot of this cyborg version of myself who wakes up to a world and over time is trying to like break apart the system into what is reprogrammed using agency, defiance, unlearning and reclaiming, and it becomes this sensory of memories that actually end up flooding back and kind of trying to waft through them and sort through them. And at the end of the show, I created this part of the program where it showcases my emotions using an emotion recognition algorithm, and then asked me a series of questions, kind of like a CAPTCHA, maybe a Turing test, or maybe a therapist asking me if I'm okay. But in creating Under Overwhelmed, I get this like overwhelming response from people about their conceptions of the cyborg, and it led me to this journey to ground and contextualize myself in my own personal history as a human and specifically a Korean American woman. So I created this piece called Sukdeok. Sukdeok is a rice cake. It's a Korean rice cake made from the mugwort plant. And I went through this kind of quickly to get to kind of more current time. But Sukdeok is a performance lecture about diaspora and temporality and displacement. I'm kind of grappling with the mugwort rice cake as a way to examine the history of like my family, chronology, but also the history of the Korean mugwort plant offers a lot of spiritual and temporal ideologies. And also, there's this Korean myth that a bear turned woman by eating mugwort and garlic for 100 days, and that being kind of part of the origin story of like the earth and the land. And so I bring in a lot of different concepts of matrilineal lineage, the freezer as a method to preserve and pause time, my body from and a foreigner to my homeland. And so I do this like large span of research, kind of looking at academic and scientific literature. I kind of create a paper about it. This is a bunch of images I'm starting to collect from JSTOR about the women who are making rice cakes, the rice fields, the mugwort plant. And in doing so, I learn about foodways, which if you look into food studies, it's this idea of looking at dishes or cuisines or countries to understand politics, society, race, class, and gender through the proliferation or changes in a food. So now I'm using mugwort as this way to kind of examine and understand my family and also my home, but also mugwort as a plant that's kind of declining due to globalization and climate change. So it's kind of being reduced, but at the same time, it's being kept alive because the mugwort rice cake is so important to so many ceremonies and rituals and celebrations. There's this kind of like cultural loop that's happening. So it becomes sort of like a metaphor that I use to understand my family, that even as the recipes or even relationships get lost due to the sands of time, just like the mugwort plant, what is in my agency to now freeze or preserve and honor the tradition of my mothers before me? So the performance is actually a 2-channel video. So there's 2 videos on either side. The audience is kind of sitting in the middle and forced to kind of choose what they're going to watch. And it's about one side is what is lost and the other side is what is gained. And one kind of excerpt from it is, if a food tells community and identity formation, then what does it mean for a foodway wanting to return to a tradition that may not exist as it was, that cannot pedal back in reverse, to a home that cannot be recalled or is lost entirely? Food does not evolve on its own, but is nurtured by those who care for it and care to pursue it. And I kind of end the moment in this like field of mugwort, virtual mugwort around me, kind of referencing these dreams that I started having of seeing my grandmother in the mugwort fields. And then I made a VR version of this experience, so people could experience it from anywhere. But also for the ceramicists out there, this is me trying to throw pottery, but virtually. Yay! But let's take a moment to recap. I threw a lot at everybody, but basically I start with this idea that data's cool. How can I use it in a dance performance? Can it tell me something deeper about the dancers or even myself? Can it make some kind of unique performance that is something totally new? But also, you can use data and programming to make musical tools about trying not to go crazy during a pandemic. But also another way to not go crazy during a pandemic is to think about yourself as a cyborg and make a one-woman show about it. It's the concepts of cyborg, these expressions of programmed individuals trying to unlearn a habituated self. And then realizing how deeply important it is to now reconnect again with my humanity, specifically my family, my mother, my grandmother through performance lecture on mugwort rice cakes. And it's this act of chronicling the narrative of my family that brings me to this point, the generative collage. And so my artistic process, exposes the fragments that fray from the entropic self, my selves and cells, histories and chronologies, memories and dreams, past and futures, and then remembers them as an act of collaging together something that demands a deeper and more greater honesty, a revelation. So now I've begun to see identity not just as these layers or these characters or even facets of myself that I show to people or fragments that are trying to fall apart, but it's actually a collage. For me, collage becomes a site of identity formation, overlaid, remapped, recontextualized, pieced together. Is my identity interconnected, woven? Is it an assemblage? And so I set off on this journey of the generative collage, and I'm going to note these are very early experiments, and there's so much more that I would love to explore, but you found me at this one moment in time where kind of all these worlds are colliding. And so what you see here is this, I basically create programs and systems using code and software to make these weavings or collages, if you will. What you're seeing here right now is a weaving of a bunch of landscape photography I've taken throughout my life, mapped with, microscopic imagery of my hair and my skin. And then I created a program exploring text. So I created first these writing works called the fragments, very inspired by Harry Dodge and Maggie Nelson, if you're familiar with their work, but inspired by some of the thoughts that I had when I went on walks, a lot of theory, a lot of writing on academic literature, things about my family, my mother, my childhood, my aspirations. I write them down in these kind of little short form bites, if you will, called the fragments. And listening to Maggie Smith, who wrote a memoir, a series of poems that became a memoir, had a chapter called the cento, where, if you're not familiar with the cento, it's a form of poetry where you actually cut strips of previous poems or a variety of poems and then place them together in a new way. And so Maggie Smith talks about the cento as a way for different parts of her life to meet together at this one point. So I start taking all my fragments that I wrote, I throw them into a text scrambler that I created using code, and it just takes all the text, cuts it up, and just shakes them up and sends them back to me into these new lines. And something that happened that really changed everything for me is I started writing a little bit about this thing called the Borsuk-Ulam theorem, which is this mathematical proof. Basically, in short, it suggests that there must be one pair of two polar opposite points on the Earth, on the surface of the Earth, that must have the same temperature at any point in time. And I'm writing about this, I'm thinking about it, and we know this to be the true case because of math and our understandings of temperature and atmosphere. But I also write about my relationship with my mother, and the cento shakes it up and puts those two together and comes out with this. My mother and I exist on two separate planes that must have the same temperature. We don't always know how to talk to each other, but exist always as a pair of polar opposite points. I love this idea of that we are from the earth and that we have to abide by the same physical properties of the earth, but it's also this moment of joy and value of relinquishing the sense of agency, that there's some things that I can do, and there's some things that I can build a program to kind of shake things up in a new way and put things together I never would have thought. And in doing so, building a series of frameworks to make these pairings or weavings that come entirely new to me, that make new meanings that feel just as true. And from that, I started building grid collages. These are collages pieced together from faces of my mother, my grandmother, and I. And some weavings also done in that work. And this is, once again, very early experimentations, but it just wouldn't be right to talk about this work without bringing up my class last week. So at Anderson Ranch, last week I taught generative collage, which I really do believe that pedagogy is very intertwined and integrated into my art practice. I hope my students learn something from me, but know that I learned just as much from them and from all of this dialogue and kind of pursuing this idea of bridging your art practice and code together in some way that feels really good and generative to you. So that was the point of this class, and that's all of us sitting together with our collages. And then I wanted to leave us with some final pieces of their works. So these are the final projects from that class last week. And also want to give a shout out to my VR painting class. I'm doing VR painting for teens this week, so feel free to come check it out on Friday, see what we're up to. And with that all being said, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chelly. Our next speaker is Yari Mena. Yari Mena is a Mexican-American mixed media artist from Atlanta, Georgia. She earned her BFA from Georgia State University. Yari was a distinguished fellow at the Hambridge Center for Creative Arts and a recipient of the Anderson Ranch Internship and Professional Development Award. Her work has been featured in Target's Corporate Hispanic Heritage Month initiative in 2020, Sola Art Market, and the Hapeville Depot Museum. Yari's work investigates how memories change to protect people, relationships, and aid survival. Please help me welcome Yari to the stage.
Thank you, Betsy, for that lovely introduction. Chelly, that was an amazing presentation. And thank you, everyone, for having me here today. My name is Yari, as we have established. This is me as a child when I was in kindergarten. I don't know what both of those ribbons are, but I knew that I wanted to draw a hand drawing a picture for this art contest, and I was debating whether to draw it or to color the hand blue or green, and my teacher walked by and said, "Don't paint it green because it's going to look like a frog hand." So I colored it blue, and that's the story of this picture. So I'll talk a little bit about my family first because much of the work that I make has to do with them. So use the laser pointer. This is my dad, and this is my mom wearing the Selena shirt, and I'm hidden under the Selena shirt somewhere. They immigrated to the U.S. from Mexico, got married, or got together in Atlanta, and then had me, my brother Jesus, and my youngest brother Joseph. Please don't laugh at the Georgia snow. I know it's a whole other, this doesn't have anything on Colorado snow. But for a while, it was the three of us. Growing up, I was really close with my brother Jesus. And we, I want to say took care of, but I'm sure we also bullied Joseph. So Joseph, if you're listening and tuned into the live stream, I'm really sorry. When I was 16, my parents had Anna, and so I became a big sister. I'd always wanted a sister. I was super excited, but I also became caretaker number 3, which had its ups and downs, but overall was and is marvelous. She's 12 now, and it's so interesting to hear a middle schooler's thoughts on the world and her take on the day every single day. And with that, we go into repressed memories, which was my first, well, this is the first iteration of repressed memory. So this is a 4x6 photograph that I exposed to heat with a heat gun, sanded, and painted on, in this case with oil paint. Sorry, it's a little too close to my face. And I had made originally about 30 of these, torn them up, torn the other 29 up, and then got to the bottom of the pile, saw this one, and was like, I should not have torn all of these up. But the torn up ones were for a project, and I turned it in, passed, but I didn't feel like it was what I wanted that work to become. So 2 years later, I came back to it, came back to those same pictures that I was working with before. This time, I still applied heat to it. I still sanded it. But instead of applying paint with a brush, I began to pour ink on them. And so at the beginning, I was really only using a couple of colors, 3, 4 colors: purple, India ink, black, turquoise, and gold, just to kind of get a feel for how I wanted the ink to react with the photograph. And so I kind of played with how much I wanted to reveal of the original photograph, how much I wanted to cover up. And so this series has a lot of, that's 3 of the same photographs. Oops. There we go. And so you can kind of see here like the blinds in a few of them. A lot of repeating imagery, but all distorted and all covered by ink. Eventually, I decided to start working with family photographs, copies of family photographs, and began incorporating collage into them, into the works, as well as being a bit more protective of the image. I didn't feel like this series required me to cover up as much of the figures as the ones before. And so I worked with a number of photographs from my mom's archive and assured her that they were copies, because they were. And also began to experiment with other forms of mark making. So this is a picture of my aunt Minerva, and instead of sanding it, I used a quarter to scratch at the painting and make these little triangle cuts. And then I pasted these photographs into those old school photo albums with the peeling plastic that you put back on, the magnetic ones. And these have all been 4x6 up until this point. So this image, this photograph, was probably the first one that I wanted to plan out a little more. That's me when I was 3 or 4 most likely. Not that it matters. And I had drawn the composition in my sketchbook, wanted to think ahead of time where I wanted the ink to travel, where I wanted to pour it, what colors I wanted to use. Up until this point, I had really left it up to chance to a degree, how the images would turn out, and then just come back if I wasn't happy, add to them or cut them up or put them away for another time. And when I came to the ranch a couple years ago, I took a deviation from the photographs because it's kind of impossible not to explore other mediums, or at least be, inspired by so many artists around you, especially here. And I'm sure you guys have felt it already, even though it's only the second day of the week. I'm sure you guys have talked to your roommate or somebody at lunch or dinner and heard about what they're doing. So I jumped back into printmaking and did these monoprints. This is of Hayes Creek Falls in Carbondale. So some of them are real landscapes. Some of these 2 are imagined or daydreamt. And then I came back to the photographs, went through the archive on my phone, and kind of focused on place. So this is the MARTA train that I would take to school every day when I was in undergrad, and I would try to take pictures of it when it was empty or take pictures through the windows. This one has only been exposed to heat, and it's a really specific type of photo paper. And I've just always loved how this paper reacted with these, to the heat. It just kind of becomes orange and tears and just makes these really lovely glowy marks. Then I, again, took another deviation from painting photographs, altering photographs themselves, and came back to an image of a painting I had made and made a relief print. This was more so, I guess I was a bit stuck at the time and just needed to sit with an old image, but reinvent it in some way. So stepping away from my typical medium and learning a new one was really helpful for me at the time. And when I came back to this old work, this one is about 20 by 30, I felt a lot more compelled to add layers, to sand some more, to add more heat to it, just to kind of push the reduction and the additive qualities that I could contribute to the work. So in this one, I've also added latex paint, drawn on it with China marker, added color shift paints, which are my new favorite thing. Then I ordered some more photographs from the same supplier and found that they had changed the paper type, which at first was devastating because it didn't do the glowy marks that the old paper used to create, but it definitely taught me to shift gears or to be more flexible. So the new photographs had a more visceral quality to them in that they felt like a giant hand had like crunched them up. So in this one, I wanted to emphasize that, placing ink where the crumples kind of dipped into the photograph. I spray painted it, added copper leaf. This one is a bit more minimal than the previous ones. And after being thrown through a loop with the paper supplier, I figured, with the help of my roommate at the time, that it would be a wonderful idea to just test out different types of papers, to print my own photographs. At the time I was able to and had the means to. So then this one I also applied heat to, but found that with this type of paper, the reaction of the photograph was much different. Like it would crack like a windshield instead of opening up like a crater. I went in with solvents to push the emulsion around and give it this like dreamy effect. And I still kind of keep that reference of the blinds in this work, at least. They're implied in this one through the shadows. Then this is another work that I made at that time. It's a self-portrait. It's a photograph of me as a child from a photo album that I found in my grandmother's home when I went to go visit my grandfather in 2019. So originally I had poured these marks, and at the time that I was making it, I saw it as these vines trapping this child. Pushed the paint around a little bit with a brush, and then I had a wonderful conversation with another artist who came in and said, like, oh, these look like fairy wings. Like, it looks like you're imagining or transforming into a fairy. And it was just a really lovely way to, I guess it shifted my perspective of the photograph of myself, in this work at least. So I began to treat the photograph differently, I guess. I went in with an X-Acto knife and drew with it around the hem of the dress, the shoes, threw it in a laser engraver to kind of emphasize these fairy wings and the pattern in the background tablecloth. This is a picture from earlier. It's of my parents, and this is the picture of the picture that I took. Also, same processes, heat, solvents, and ink. Clearly, these purple and copper. Here, I tried to kind of paint it over these like binder rings. And then I threw the photograph into Illustrator and drew or traced, quote unquote, lines in the rocks and the lines in the waves, lines on this tree, this like tree line up here. And then when I threw it in the laser engraver, those lines that I had drawn were the instructions to tell the laser engraver where to cut. And they didn't line up exactly, but that's also just the nature of memory. You can remember as closely as you can how something occurred, how something transpired, but it's not always going to be 100% accurate. This is from my solo show in the fall at the Hapeville Depot Museum. We had some pan de muerto and some Mexican pastries at the show. It took place around, the opening took place around Day of the Dead, so we had a lot of marigolds, and you'll see why that's relevant at the end. This is not the best picture, but an image of how the photo album is displayed. It was placed on a podium, and visitors were welcome to flip through it, ask questions about it. And at that show at the Hapeville Depot, I was fortunate enough to work with Samantha Singleton, who was the woman in the picture with me in the slide before, and she had me put my artist statement up in Spanish and English, as well as all of my artist titles in both languages. And it was really, it just felt really good to be able to do that in that space. And just the process of like I wrote my statement in English, like I was born here in the US. I speak Spanish relatively well, but don't often express myself to the same degree in Spanish that I do in English. So seeing these two statements together, I know they both say the same thing, but they feel very different when I look at them or when I read them. And it almost felt like I was unlocking a different part of, maybe not myself, but of my identity or something of the sort. Then I went to Hambridge, which was really fun and rejuvenating. I worked on a series of photographs, attempting to break out of the rectangle. You can kind of see where I did not in some of these. But I really went in with the X-Acto knife, cut some shapes out, kind of rethought how I wanted to approach collage. So again, this is my sister from the beginning. So I wanted to break up the rectangle. So I cut her out, separated her from the background, completely covered the background in what I've heard been described as Easter egg colors, which are these like purples, glitter, these like metallic color shift pigments. And also thought about like, when is it okay not to cover a photograph or not to paint it? And I felt like this one, which is of my dad and my grandfather seeing each other for the first time in like 13 or 15 years. This one felt like one that I couldn't paint at the time. That might change. And through the works, the photographs that I work with of my family and of myself, I feel like it just kind of helps me understand my family connections, our interactions through this like cultural disjunction that we have sometimes within our own home. Given that like my parents are immigrants, my siblings and I were born here, and we have like very different experiences. A lot of experiences are similar, but there's the ones that are different to such a degree that like sometimes it feels like we can't see each other's perspective. And I think this photograph with my brother kind of makes me think about like, well, when I tried to hold on to these connections or to like my family, when we try to hold on to each other, like, does it feel like we're holding each other up? Does it feel like we're suffocating each other? Are we being jerks to each other? Are we supporting each other? The answer to all of those is probably yes, and also no. But it's just been a really insightful process to work with my family's photographs and just move towards understanding how we operate as a family, how I understand myself as well. This is a self-portrait, if you couldn't tell. I'm back here somewhere with my very sparkly purple dress. And I covered it with blue, purple glitter, and wanted to mimic this pattern underneath. Added flower petals, pasted pieces from other photographs, and was just wanting to focus on composition in this work. And this is my last slide. This is another photograph, self-portrait, where I move towards covering myself less or hiding myself less and maybe just closer to expressing myself through a combination of vomit-like things that I find beautiful. So altogether, I would say they look like vomit, but individually, you know, I love all of these things. I love this marigold. I love this this teal color, the purple, this metallic color shift paint. I love salt, which is also in here. These little grains of salt. And altogether, like, as I said, it look like vomit, or it may feel like a mess or look like a mess, but it kind of helps me connect that to moments where like I've lived through with other people that feel like a mess, but where we can find like these pockets of like moments that we can appreciate or be grateful for through those hardships. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. We now will move into a quick question and answer period. Oh, Kevin's way ahead of me. And so we'll open it up for questions if anyone has one they would like to ask. Great.
I'll fix the lights too. Hello, thank you both so much. That was so awesome. what I felt was like so exciting and inspiring about both of your talks was I like didn't know, Chelly, how much of a writer you were, and then Yari, I know you like are in the paint studio this week, but you use so much photo, and both of you like just dipping your toes and experimenting in so many different worlds. Not dipping your toes in like a talking down to way, dipping your toes in a really beautiful way in these areas. And I was wondering, yeah, beautiful dipping. I was wondering if it feels important to either of you to like identify as like a new media artist, a painter, a writer, or if it feels kind of all amorphous and not like as a label or as an identity, not relevant or not relevant to you in your art making.
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. I guess in practice, I don't feel the need to necessarily label myself, but new media inherently is so wide-ranging and far-reaching, and I think the reason why I label myself as such is my use of technology and my criticality with technology is very much in the new media world and lens, and I think it helps find and situate myself in the communities that I want to share with, but that doesn't mean I'm limited to such, and I'm so inspired by your talk. I think I have to manifest us collaborating together, like the digital collage with the physical collage I think are so beautiful, and I don't find any necessary need to limit myself through any kind of convention or norm, but purely as just a way to kind of be like, hey, I do technology, that's cool.
Thank you for that super insightful question, Dagny. Funnily enough, today in my workshop, our class was we were going through artist inspiration and had a brief discussion about what you just asked, actually. There's this quote by Radcliffe Bailey where he says that, and he was a sculptor and painter, but he identified as an artist. So that's pretty much what he was saying. Like, I don't identify as either one, like I'm just an artist. And I feel I'm not necessarily particular towards like one label or another. I got my degree in painting, so I feel like I probably would say if I had to choose that I'm a painter or, but yeah, I think as much as art is changing right now and as much as we can blend mediums, it's going to be more and more difficult for artists to really label themselves as one thing.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else have another question?
Hi, this is a question for Chelly, but I was wondering like what kind of code you use. Like, is this stuff that you make your weaving images? Is it like a machine learning model or like a scrambler? Like, yeah.
So depending on the different art projects, they use different things, but I predominantly use P5.js, which is a version of processing, which is a graphics-based code. If you're familiar with like the arts and code world, there's processing, which is using Java, and then P5, which is using a style of JavaScript. So it's basically code that's meant to be on the web. So there's this interesting kind of modality of I'm using something that's open source, made for the web, made for the World Wide Web to be accessible to, and then trying to make these intimate performances that I only want seen by like 10 people at a time. But yeah, so as far as the machine learned stuff, usually I'm using some kind of a library that already exists, like ML5 for kind of pose tracking, or as far as a text scrambler, that's just kind of using JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, no P5 necessary. But anyway, I'm kind of using different technologies as they fit different needs, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, I did. Thank you so much.
Of course.
All right. Oh, we have one over here.
Hi, thank you both for sharing your work. This is a question for Chelly. I was wondering if you could talk more about your process and how you think about the context in which you show your work, because a lot of it, sometimes you're using a gallery space, sometimes it's just online or a zine. And I'm wondering how the content that you're interested in, like how you're thinking about the relationship between, I'm interested in this, then deciding like, how do I want to present this to people, or choosing which method to use to engage with people, and also like how that's related to some of these spaces being more specifically art spaces and then other times not necessarily.
Wow, what an amazing question. Can we break it down? I will start with maybe with like my choices for the where and when of kind of showing my work, and then maybe we can break it down from there. But I guess the value of using code is effectively to make work that's accessible truly anywhere. Like all you need is internet bandwidth and like a computer, which also is technically not like fully accessible also to many different kinds of societies and individuals. But it is much more broad than the white cube gallery. So it's something that lives kind of more accessibly on the internet. And so something like the musical web tool that I used, coping mechanisms, it was just kind of a way and a framework to make a musical tool and play around and be able to share it. But then when it came to more of my performances, they use web technologies, and I'm kind of critiquing the idea of the web technology, and I'm making these irreverent web pieces, but they're actually not meant to be shared with anybody else except for who's in that room and for the people sharing it. For the nature of, like, I don't want images of my grandmother floating on the internet everywhere. I already kind of have reservations actually about this being live streamed in some ways. So I readapted that initial piece that I performed where I actually cut out the faces as a kind of a nod to keeping things very sacred to me, and that these images are for kind of me only and for the people I choose to share them with. And so using kind of location, access, accessibility as the methods of how I kind of present this work. And also there's a lot of interesting literature on things like opacity, which is a term from Zach Blass, on like intentionally kind of obscuring your data or information. And so kind of making these choices about what I want to share, where I want it to go, especially when it's so easily proliferated on technology, is kind of the ways that I make these choices. But does that answer your question? I kind of rambled. Cool, thanks.
All right. Oh, okay. Here you go.
Thank you both so much for sharing. I have a question for both of you. So maybe Yari first. I was wondering how it felt to go through your family archives, because I was thinking about how we are constructed as much by the people we love, and you are literally using the photographs taken by your parents, your family members, to construct yourself and to respond to. It's like, what are some of the choices that they made in terms of composition or lighting or framing or scale that you find yourself being drawn to or repelled from? And how do you respond to that in your art?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I've thought about the composition of photographs as much, but something I did notice is that, like, in photographs of that my mom would take of my grandmother, she'd be very serious. But when I met her, she was laughing all the time. So it was just really interesting to go back and see, like, okay, like, we have this like stoic front, but behind the photographer, you know, a lot more warm than that. And then I would say, like, the things that I took from the photographs, or the things I thought about more, they really evoked a lot of memories, in the sense that, like, I looked back and saw, like, how much our lives had changed since I was born, how much my mom's life had changed in a short amount of time before I was born. I would say, like, just the events themselves were maybe what impacted me the most, or what I thought about the most going through my family archive.
Thank you. And Chelly, I love the whimsy and the play that you bring through the technology and the research and the very critical lens you bring to like oftentimes a misunderstood like field of internet and coding and algorithms and stuff. Do you think that each of the programs you use inherently has like emotion or personality or like a temperature?
I
I mean, I think they must. I can't say who is what, and like I say who, but like what program has what vibe or what kind of energy or emotion. But I do think a lot about how code is just made by people. Like it is very true that the programs and tools reflect who makes them, what data sets they use, and that being very much driven into the energy of the technology. But as far as like, well, yeah, I guess maybe I can speak a little bit to P5, but P5 is a web-based version of processing, which was created by Casey Reese. Processing was created by Casey Reese and Ben Fry to make a code kind of for artists. It was more a language-based, accessible model for artists to kind of be able to get in there and just make stuff with graphics very instantaneously. And then P5 was adapted, created by Lauren Lee McCarthy, to build out almost like this community. P5 is open source, and it has a community statement that says very actively, like, no code snobs. Like, we want to have like everyone to learn and to come to the space with open minds and with listening ears. And I think that actually really reflects into the technology, actually. There's certain things that are just really cool and accessible that I would, just from my positionality and my privilege, I wouldn't have thought to create. And it just makes the program so much better in so many ways. So yeah, I think there must be. I can't name all of them and what their vibes are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, just one more. I got to get back there. Sorry, I'm going to cut through. I made it. Okay.
Thank you. I have a question for Chelly, but I do quick comment. Yari, you just said something I thought was so interesting about like the distance between the photograph and your embodied direct experience with a person, like the stoicism in a photo versus this other thing. So anyway, I'm gonna be thinking about that for a long time. My question for you is, when you're doing your, I'll say digital weaving, does it follow the same logic as a physical weaving, or are there like other systems that you apply that make it kind of function differently?
That is such a good question. I don't know how many people know this, but I gave like a huge history of computing lesson where I kind of like pull from actually very many lenses of African American history, queer history, like American Indian history. And anyway, point is, computation as we know it is definitely predecessed. What is it like? What came before it was weaving, and the punch card and the jacquard loom were how we like came up with the conceptions of computers. And so with that kind of in mind, that's what gave me this idea of making these digital weavings. But do they mimic any kind of actual weaving? I actually don't know. I should really look more into weaving. I know as much as like warp and weft, and I try to be very considerate about like the metaphor of the warp being kind of the stronghold of the architecture, and then the weft being kind of what is more stretchy, and what that metaphor means for me. But how the code works is it randomly selects a point on the image and then selects a certain kind of like width or height randomly, and then cuts the pixels across the screen, and then will remap them in like a new layout kind of randomly, and then does the warp and the weft. And is that how it would actually weave something? I'm not sure, but like I would love to experiment with that. What a great idea.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Yari and Chelly, for that amazing presentation. And everyone, have a great rest of your week. Good night, and we'll see you around.
Thank you so much.